All righty then. Just for the camera, we'll introduce ourselves. Just for the recording. It's just gone. Welcome to the Statutory Licensing Committee, 2:30, Thursday, the 6th of July, 2023. Before we start, we'll just introduce ourselves. I'm Clive Tufy, Councillor for Vane Award. I'm the chair of the committee.
I'm Dave Isaac, Councillor for Pindarren.
And I'm Lee Davis, Councillor for Gurness Wood.
Yeah, I'm Simon Jones. I'm a solicitor with the council, and I'm here to advise the committee.
Jo Baber, licensing manager for the council.
Mike Jessup, independent veterinary surgeon.
Right, thank you very much. The first item on the agenda is apologies for absence. There are no apologies for absence. No. The second item on the agenda is declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? No. The third item on the agenda is the animal boarding licence for Dogs Den Day Centre. I understand Joe is going to look at the report for us. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair, members. So this report is in relation to an application for an animal boarding establishment licence. The application was submitted by Mr Julian Bones for Dogs Den Daycare, Units D and E, 14 Pant Industrial Estate, Merthyr. A copy of the application form and the accompanying plan can be found in Appendix A of the report. An inspection was carried out by a licensing officer and a vet on the 13th of June 2023. The inspection report, which was prepared by the vet following the visit, can be found at Appendix B. This authority has standard conditions that are attached to all animal boarding establishment licences, and a copy of those can be found at Appendix C. The veterinary report identified that the premises was failing to comply with 4 areas of our standard conditions. And the report also recommends that additional conditions are to be attached to this specific licence should it be granted. It is also apparent from the inspection that the term kennel, which is used in the standard conditions, is not applicable to this premises, as the pens that they use do not have a combined sleeping and individual exercise area. Members are therefore asked to consider removing any kennel conditions which cannot be complied with, and then amending the term kennel to time-out pen for all other relevant conditions. An animal boarding establishment licence was previously in place at this premises from the 18th of February 2022 up until the 31st of December 2022 when it expired. That licence was issued following numerous inspections to bring the premises into compliance, as well as attendance at licensing subcommittee. The relevant legislation for this application is the Animal Boarding Establishments Act 1963, and further details can be found in section 5 of the report. Mr Bones has chosen not to attend today's hearing. He has submitted written representations and accompanying documents which have been circulated to members and Mr Jessup prior to this hearing. In determination of this matter, councillors may take any of the steps outlined in section 2.1 of the report. Thank you, Chair.
Perhaps Mr Jessup could outline the problems he's found with this premises, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you. I won't go over the previous one, although it'll probably be quite evident in my report that there have been some historic issues with Mr Bones's facility, but a lot of those have largely been addressed, and he did actually achieve licence in the previous year and then had let it lapse for this year. So we went back to look at see if we could get him back onto the licence statute. The things that were outside compliance, so were failing at the inspection, were areas of wood that we'd identified previously and warned him that they were likely to wear and tear and decay over time, And when we went and looked, they were taking in water, they were easily soiled, so they couldn't then be cleaned properly. And that was one of the conditions that he failed on, that it was not possible to clean that particular area. And in fact, the skirting was coming away from the wall and could potentially pose a hazard to the dogs when they were running past it. So that was one area. The concrete floor in that link between the indoor and outdoor was pitted, and it was, when we went there, it was pooling water. So there was actually puddling there, which is a condition that is not allowed under any licensing regime. So that was a failure for him. In the isolation facility, he used to have a lot of this sort of featherboard or composite boarding that he then painted. The problem with that is the dogs then scratch it, break through, and then it takes in water and dog urine and all sorts of other saliva and other dog chew items. And he kept that and retained that in the isolation area, which obviously as an isolation area, you're going to be putting a sick dog in there, was even more of an imperative of an area to keep clean. So that was a failure for him. And the electrical safety certificate, which he'd always promised and I'd never seen before, and he always promised he would send in to the local authority, and I assume he must have done at some point to get his previous license, that didn't, when we looked at it, appear to have an expiry date on it. I spoke to Mr. Bones about it and he couldn't find one. It was towards the end of the inspection, and Mr. Bones was wanting to argue about conditions and kennel sizing. So we didn't actually get a chance to look at this in detail. But now I've seen the copy that's been sent in, it does say quite clearly on the page we didn't look at that it is valid for 3 years. So it was, I think, issued in 21, so it will be valid through to 24. So it is a valid certificate. That's the electrical certificate, yeah.
So for a house, it's 5 years. They just brought in a law in Wales. It's for 5 years. Seems odd. It's 3 years.
I know. I would have expected it to be 5 years. So there's something the electrician's not happy about that's made them put a 3-year review on it. And it might be that it's commercial premises. It might be that because it's an industrial unit and because dogs are in close proximity, they've decided it needs to be only a 3-year re-inspection review.
In relation to that, so we got those 4 particular concerns that you had, which are highlighted at the beginning of your report. And then you go on later in the report to mention some other concerns you have, that which could be remedied by way of adding additional conditions. Do you want to tell us something about that?
Yes, if we can go through some of those, because there were some items that would need for him to be operating for you to be able to check. What he was claiming is that he's changed from Dogs Den Limited to Dogs Den in his own name, and therefore all his previous records about boarding and logging and recording of dogs and taking records were not relevant to that inspection. Well, that's fine. That's his choice. We're doing it as a brand new inspection. So we couldn't look back at how he managed dogs when they were in the facility, because he wasn't having dogs in the facility. So we've got to wait for him to be licensed before we can then check his compliance on those. But there was some evidence in some of the paperwork he'd had that he wasn't keeping a close check on things like vaccination certificates. Now, when dogs go to these facilities, they must be vaccinated, because you don't want an unvaccinated dog in a bunch of them. And he was only saying, yes, they're vaccinated, without actually proving it by taking a picture of their veterinary certificate and keeping that on his file, or keeping the book that the owner would have. And so we had no means of confirming, other than just him ticking a box to say, yes, vaccinated, whether they really were covered against the things we need them to be covered against. So that was one of the things that needs to happen going forward. And probably the biggest area for me is it's an industrial unit. It's up on the Pant estate. It's built as an industrial unit, not as a dog holding facility. And it's not insulated. These are big units and they're quite difficult to heat in the winter and cool in the summer. And I've always been concerned on every visit I've been there as to whether he can genuinely keep dogs between 10 and 26 degrees C and can keep them cool when it gets very hot and warm when it gets very cold. And I think that he really needs to show that he is taking accurate temperature recordings. He's got thermometers there. He's claiming he's using them, but I've never seen evidence that he actually understands that dogs have to be maintained between those two temperatures. And that's quite an important one going forward. The other thing that concerned me was his staffing, because the general regulations and because it's a outside dog boarding traditional regulations, the general view across the country is that for managing a daycare centre, you need to have a ratio of staff to dogs, and it's normally 1 person to 10 dogs is what the standard has been brought in at. He also runs dog walking services, and he also goes to people's houses to look after dogs when they're not there. So he'll call in twice a day to feed them and manage them. Now, my concern is if he's using the staff that should be on the premises, keeping that ratio of 1 to 10, and they're popping off every so often to go and check another dog, we're going to lose that ratio. So I think going forward, we need to see that he's got a proper staff rota. He records people in and out as much as he records dogs in and out, so that we've always got that supervision of dogs in his facility at all times.
It's probably in the notes, if I don't mind me asking, how many dogs per day is he licensed to keep? Is it like 20? It seems
Applying for 20 dogs.
20.
Yeah.
I thought I read that. So there should be 2 staff there at all times. Thanks.
Yes, that's my understanding. Now, the problem is if he only has 10 dogs booked in for a day, then it's fair that he doesn't employ 2 members of staff because he's then overemploying. So that's what that should do, is be a historic record that we can look back on at next inspection to say, yep, you were compliant with that going forward, we've got no issues. And if he falls non-compliant with it, then you'd probably need to tighten up his conditions in future inspections.
If I could ask, the initial things you mentioned are all easily solved, really, like the wooden panels and the puddling on the floor and that sort of thing. But it is right, this temperature with this heat wave we've just had now, keeping below 26 could be difficult, couldn't it? Oh, mind you, I suppose if you had an air cooler like those, you could manage it perhaps.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You've spotted the hot temperature issue, and more of it we're likely to get. And what a lot of doggy daycare centres have in their written policies is if the temperature goes above 25 degrees C, they close and they don't take residents in because they can't keep them cool and they can't keep the dogs safe. And particularly if you've got dogs playing and likely to overheat themselves, you've got a danger for the welfare of the animals. So there needs to be into his written policies how he deals with temperature when it gets too hot or too cold, and what means of air conditioning has he got and what means of heating has he got.
Have you got any questions at all?
Yeah. Thanks. With regard to the staffing, is he regarding himself as a member of staff on site, or is he employing 2 members of staff? Because as you've said, he does a dog walking thing as well. So what would be the consequences of one of the, would he still be in compliance if himself and the other member of staff was there, or is he employing two members of staff?
I do entirely, and you're absolutely right, and it is one of the problems with Mr. Bones is when you ask him a question, you never get an answer because he wants to come up with a new condition to cover that particular point. But what you as an authority need to do is say, yes, you can count as a member of staff, but you must log yourself in and out on the staff booking system. If you go off to a meeting here or go and look at something else there, you take yourself out of that facility and you drop that staff ratio. You must make sure you've got cover and they come in and replace you as that one member of staff.
And with regard to the overheating and stuff like that, is there any requirement for the staff to have any sort of basically first aid training for dogs for the licensing?
The problem with the conditions for licensing, yes, that's ideal, and it's a very sensible thing that should go in. And most of the modern licensing regimes and what we will get in the future is a requirement that a member of staff is trained to an animal care level. But that's not there at the moment. And all we ask for at the moment is they have a first aid kit and they have a written protocol on what to do in the case of illness or problems with dogs. So I would expect to see in his staff manual how to deal with wounds, dog bites, unfortunately, sickness, diarrhea, coughing, and how he'd manage those sorts of issues. His staff manual, which we didn't see at the time, but we've all subsequently seen, is very thin on how to manage sick dogs and what to do with them. And I would like to see that a bit beefed up. But the law doesn't tell you how beefed it should be.
You got any questions?
No, it was just along what Councillor Isaacs has said about health and safety. In terms of the opening hours, what are the opening hours?
So the license doesn't actually set license opening hours. It is a generic one. But what Mr. Jessup has recommended for this is that we don't allow overnight boarding because of the he hasn't got kennels that have got the sleeping and exercise areas all in one. So that is a recommendation from the vet, is that for this particular license we do state that it's not overnight. And I think in Mike's report, it's daytime is between 7 AM and 10 PM as a standard definition.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Joe, am I correct that he's not actually applying for overnight stay?
With this legislation, there isn't a distinction between the two. He is applying for an animal boarding establishment license, and that license does not normally differentiate between the two. However, based on this particular premises, it is being recommended that we do differentiate between the two.
Okay, but my understanding is that his intention isn't to overnight board for the time being. Is that correct?
He hasn't stipulated. Yeah.
If I could just interject there, one of the things that caused a little bit of alarm and reason I put that recommendation in, that he keeps saying that if he's granted a license under the 1963 Act, he is allowed to keep dogs overnight, because that's what the Act actually allows, is 24-hour boarding. And my point to him was that if he did keep dogs overnight, then he would be breaching the Animal Welfare Act, because he wouldn't be keeping the dogs in a suitable environment. And what he keeps coming back to and arguing, and why kennels keep coming back as an issue with Mr. Bones, is that he wants to have a doggy daycare centre, but he then wants to get hold of this boarding license from the local authority and then play it to his advantage. And I'm just a little bit nervous that you will then find dogs being kept overnight in facilities that are unsuitable. And I think that ought to be a very clear instruction from the authority to say, we're giving you a daycare license and daycare is between these hours.
Hence your request in your report to add these additional conditions to.
Correct,
fit.
yes.
And of course, licensing is similarly looking to, if this is granted, to amend some of the wording within the current conditions to take away the word kenneling and replace it with
Time out pen, I think
Yeah,
we agreed on, Mike, didn't we?
There's an oddity in when you're putting dogs into daycare. The whole idea is that they play as a group and they have fun as a group. But the Animal Welfare Act says quite clearly that one of the needs of a dog is to be able to be with or apart from other animals. So that means that the dog's choice, if it's having too much or is being overwhelmed by this other group, it's got to have somewhere to go to just clear its head and have, in effect, time out. And what we normally do in daycare centres is say, you need a few time out pens that dogs can retreat into in their own bed, have a sleep if they want to, and then go back and join the rest of the team. And that's the requirement. And that's, in effect, replaces kennel.
Chair, at this stage, we would normally ask Mr. Bones to give us his submissions and representations. Obviously, he is not here today. That's his decision, and he's written in with his the points he wants to make, which you have, of course, read. But I think certainly for the purpose of this public meeting, if you agree, Chair, I'll read out parts where he is specifically dealing with Mr. Jessup's report. Are you happy for me to do that?
Yes, that's okay.
Okay, well, the first page and a half is not in relation to the report specifically, so I won't read that out, but you have, of course, read that. If I go into the second page, 2/3 of the way down, he then specifically addresses his responses to Mr. Jessup's report. So number one, he says some of it is a bit disjointed, but I'll have to read it the way it is. In previous replies on this going question, I have been assured by the landlord that the materials used for the building in this establishment is the same across the country, standard breeze blocks and red brick. This would imply Mr. Jessup has issue with all agricultural buildings that meet the standard in building materials. Then he says 1.1, temperature controls have not been taken as the daycare has no license and therefore cannot operate. Awaiting for a license to start. I am no longer the director of the limited company and Dogs Den Daycare Limited no longer trades. I make this application as self-employed in a separate entity. That's already been addressed by Mr. Jessup there. Very aware of this when trading as previous inspection, he says 1.8, 2.3, he gives a date there, 6th of December 2021. 1.9, he says largely. It's not very helpful actually when we're just reading those one words out. Let's have a look. 1.9 relates to concerns about exposed wood and uncleanable sections was now largely addressed and resolved. That was in Mr. Jessup's report, and he's got largely. 1.9, jobs to be done and proof photos will be sent to licensing. Of course, we've had some photographs sent to us in this bundle here. 2.2 relates to a condition of license that should be at least one full-time member of staff is always present for a group of up to 10 dogs. He says, at present, only I work full-time along with 3 others who cover as and when required. 3.1, floor plan supplied, in Ms. Jessup's report, floor plan supplied at application must have details of the dimensions of the areas used by the dogs. There must be in meters and in length and width of each area noted. And he has said 3.1, previous floor plan was acceptable on inspections, however, will be done and sent in. 2.3, okay, so he's jumped back a bit there. I had sent into licensing department 2 years ago this. I'm not sure what he's talking about there. I think it's a floor plan he's talking about. 2 years ago, this is called the policies and procedures, where staff have to read through and understand and have conversation if required, with sign and dated on the back page, was presented at the time of inspection. 3.2, again, this is the annotated floor plan, did have prior to inspection, and Mr. Jessup agreed he had seen it before. However, now made and on display. So he's saying he's done that. 3.4, the floor of the link between the indoor and outdoor was pitted and pooling water. The surface should be rescreeded. That was what Mr. Jessup said. And he says that see photo. And of course, he sent a photograph in, which looks like it's been cemented. 3.5, this was agreed. 3.6, Mr. Jessup failed to notice page 2, top right corner to validate the date. This is the electrical certificate, I'm assuming. Yeah, okay, we've dealt with that. 3.9, Mr. Jessup says details of the current vaccination status. He says done. 3.10, a lockable medicine box must be available to hold medicines. Mr. Bones says medicine box not looked into, which is full and kept in the filing cabinet within the reception. 3.12, that relates to previously that Mr. Jessup says there was concerns about waste disposal protocols. He says this was brought up at the last inspection and proof was sent into licensing. I have contacted again for another cover letter. Contract ongoing, would have seen the bin outside. Great Western Recycling. He jumps back to 3.11. It says Mr. Jessup says the main sign on the outside advertised blood test and artificial insemination. Both of these were not available services and should be covered. He says although this is not applicable to daycare license, should be removed. Best to have been kept to normal conversation. I just criticised Mr. Jessup there. I do, however, like it to be known Mr. Jessup has failed to write that my view on artificial insemination, blood testing, this is not relevant as far as I can see. He says 5.1, he's jumping about again to 5.11. Don't know, here we are. This is, all right, this is 5.11, specific areas to ensure future compliance, need for written training policy. This is what Mr. Jessup was saying. This should include all the essential day-to-day requirements for the facility. He says, my policies and procedures should be in the file and was shown at the time of inspection. And of course, he sent this through now. 5.8.1, the register of all dogs boarded. A daily record of services and dog staying is put in a diary. That wasn't asked for, he says. A record sheet is also kept behind the bar. See in folder. And then 5.6.2, Mr. Jessup says proof of vaccination for each dog boarded or owned or trained within with the boarding dogs. He says 6.2. Up until now, every time an application has been filed out, I have asked for one, and when seen, ticked off to say I'd seen it. I think that's the one he's talking about. Example, every Wednesday, a social club is held and advertised on a Facebook page, always including the first-time attendees to bring proof of one. Okay. He then says, any suggested and taken on board, I now ask for a photocopy of the date vaccinations to accompany the registration. Conclusion. I'm surprised by the power of the expert who has refused this license on such small things which were agreed at the time of inspection as jobs to do. The previous license was granted same day and on the spot with recommendations which were done within 2 weeks and proof sent into licensing. Lawyer present at the time. Then turning over, the whole report is based on an attempt to paint me in a very poor light, which is wrong. And you see this by reading and seeing the establishment in open conversation. So I appreciate that's quite hard to understand without properly comparing this to Mr. Jessup's full report as opposed to me jumping back and forth. But you can see what he said in relation to Mr. Jessup's report. You've read this outside of this meeting. You'll see that he's attached an electrical condition report, and that's been referred to by Mr. Jessup, and he particularly refers to the second page, which wasn't looked at the time, where it says that the recent circuits installed are generally good standard. So he maintains that his electrical position is now okay. You've got the floor plan there where he sets out various locations for detectors, extinguishers, fire exit. I can't see the top one, some in glass. And then there's photographs of the inside of the premises, which shows what has been done and the various sort of logs for daily log, dog sheet, and temperature charts, and his policy and procedures. So there we are, Chair. That's what he sent in. I think at this stage it might be helpful for the committee to hear again from Mr. Jessup, because my understanding of this is, in the first instance, you have a position where Mr. Jessup has said that there are 4 major impediments that were there at the time of the inspection, which, if still present, would probably cause Mr. Jessup to say that we should not grant that license. So I think we need to ask Mr. Jessup, bearing in mind what's been said there and what's happened since, is Mr. Jessup satisfied now that we could now satisfy ourselves that those first 4 impediments are now resolved? And if that is the case, then we then need to move on to the second part of this today, is about attaching additional conditions. So, Mr. Jessup, I mean, is that the case? Bearing in mind what we've now heard from Mr. Bones, are you more or less satisfied that those 4 initial impediments are now?
Yeah, yes, he's got most of them. The only one that I haven't seen clear evidence of is the walls of the lobby between the indoor and outdoor. From the photos, it's difficult to see whether he's actually painted that or covered it, and I think that that's the one outstanding area. It's quite an important one. We had a lot of issues with wood previously, which he's rectified, and in fairness to him, he's done a lot to rectify them, and he was commended on doing so. But this one area remains outstanding, and I think that he really needs to understand that he needs to get that evidence that he's completed that part of it. It's just point 1 of those. All the others he's done.
Does anyone else have any questions? Do you have any questions? No.
That's the case. We then move on to the additional conditions that you've recommended in your report. Are you still saying those conditions are still relevant and should be something that the committee need to consider?
Yes, I think the issue with the training policy, if you look at the document that he sent in, and he says in his letter that he updates it regularly. Well, I think it was 2020 that it was last updated. And that's when he was Dogs Den Limited. Now, he wants us to draw a line between Dogs Den Limited and Dogs Den now under his sole ownership. Therefore, he ought to have updated his training policy to reflect this change of company, our company structure. And also the signatures of the employees at the back. I think the latest one was November 22, but the others go back to 2020, and it's only 3 signatures on there, and we've got no evidence that these are current employees or likely to be employees. And also there's quite a few areas that we asked him to put into that training guide that he hasn't put in. And my other concern with it is that he claimed that he doesn't feed dogs. He's only taken them in for daycare and then only with him for a short term, so he doesn't do any feeding. And yet if you read his training and staff guidance policy, it talks about how to feed dogs, when to feed them, and how to store food. Well, that should all have been taken out if he's not doing feeding. So there's evidence that he's not keeping this training policy and staff guidance up to date. And we've also, as I mentioned earlier, spoken about how to deal with dogs when they're ill. That's not in there. There's nothing to deal with how to manage temperatures when they're out of range. That should be in there. So there's still a lot of things that he needs to put in, but I would accept that these should be ongoing issues for him that we catch up in future inspections, because they're important, but I don't think they're deal breaking.
Yes. Dave.
Yeah, thank you. He said he's not feeding dogs, but if the dogs are there from first thing in the morning to last thing at night, shouldn't he be feeding the dogs?
Well, that's what we would want to see. I mean, what a lot of daycare facilities do is take dogs in for 4-hour blocks. So you either book them in for the morning or the afternoon, or you book them in for the morning and afternoon and they go home at lunchtime. So that's normally, if he doesn't have feeding, that's what I would expect to see on how he manages dogs. And it's not for us to tell him how to comply with animal welfare laws. It's for him to show that he is complying with animal welfare laws. And it will be on how he manages his dogs between his opening hours that will determine how effective he's being with animal welfare. And if he's keeping them all day for the length of time that he has the potential to do it, then yes, he should be feeding them.
We've
Back to the recommendations here. Are you finished asking questions? Sorry.
yes, we finished the question.
Okay, I think if we look at the recommendations in the report, there are a number of things that you can do today, and I'll ask you to adjourn briefly so we can consider these. But they are to grant the license now, subject to our current conditions. So that wouldn't include anything about changing the word kennels or these additional things that Mr. Jessup has asked for in his report. So if you thought that the Mr. Bones's establishment meets everything in our current conditions and you don't need any amendments or any additions, then you can grant now. Or you can refuse now if you think, no, you don't think this premises meets our conditions. So you can do those two now. But you've heard from Mr. Jessup that he is still, although he is saying that this premises are can be licensed, he's saying they should be licensed subject to additional conditions. So if that's the case, this committee, as you know, cannot amend our standard conditions. So that would have to be a separate report up to the full planning and license and regulatory committee for them to then determine whether or not they want to accept all these additional conditions that Mr. Jessup is asking for or licensing, or some of them. And if that's the case, they can then change our conditions, and then we could then grant the license subject to those conditions. But I think those are the four. Those are the four options are there. But I would ask you at this stage maybe for us to discuss where we go on this with the committee in recess. You okay with that, Chair?
Yes, thanks. Yes, that's lovely. So there's no need for Mr. Jessup to stay any longer now, is there?